So, what happens when the government is given a power but just refuses to use it? We're about to dive into this incredible legal story that, believe it or not, starts with milk prices, but ends up asking this massive question about the limits of power. This is the story of the Padfield Doctrine. Let's just start with a big question right at the heart of all this. Can a government minister, someone with real power, just ignore you? Can they look at a legitimate complaint and just say, nope, not interested, without even giving you a good reason? Well, it's a question a group of farmers decided they were going to force an answer to. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the original fight over milk. Then we'll look at the minister's big refusal. We'll follow the whole saga through the courts, and then break down the landmark ruling that gave us what we now call the Padfield Doctrine. So our story doesn't start in some stuffy courtroom. Nope. It starts out in the English countryside back in the 1960s, and it's all about something pretty simple: a fight for a fair price. Okay, so to get what's going on, you have to know about something called the milk marketing scheme. Just think of it as this huge government-run system that was supposed to keep things stable and fair for all milk producers. Set the prices, make sure everybody got a fair shake. That was the idea, anyway. But there was a pretty big problem. See, farmers in the southeast of England felt like they were getting a raw deal, consistently. They were getting paid a lot less per gallon for their milk than farmers in other parts of the country. And to them, this wasn't just a small difference, it was deeply unfair. So you've got these farmers with a very clear complaint. The next logical step, take it to the guy in charge. But this is where the story takes a wild turn and becomes a battle over this idea of unfettered discretion. Now, the law that actually created this whole milk system, the Agricultural Marketing Act, had a provision built right in. It gave the Minister of Agriculture the power to set up a committee to investigate complaints, just like this one. It seemed like the perfect solution, right? The farmers made their case, totally expecting the system to work for them. And boom, this is the moment everything pivots. The minister just flat out refused. His argument was that the power was his to use or not use however he wanted. He claimed his discretion was unfettered, basically absolute, unlimited, no questions asked. He pretty much said, I can say no, and I don't owe you any explanation. For these farmers, this was way bigger than milk prices now. This was about a fundamental principle. So they decided to do something incredible. They took on the minister himself, kicking off what would be a truly brutal uphill legal battle. And let me tell you, it was an incredibly tough fight. First, they lost in the High Court. Then they appealed, and they lost again in the Court of Appeal. I mean, at every single turn, the court seemed to be siding with the minister. It really looked like it was over. But they didn't give up. They made one last, final appeal to what was then the highest court in the UK, the House of Lords. And this, right here, is where history gets made. After this long, exhausting journey, the most senior judges in the entire country, the law lords, were finally going to have the last word. The whole case really boiled down to these two completely different ways of looking at power. On one hand, you had the minister saying, my power is absolute. On the other, you had the farmers arguing, no power is truly unlimited. It has to be used for the reason Parliament gave it to you in the first place. So the big question for the court was, did Parliament give the minister this power so he could ignore a problem or so he could actually fix it? And this quote from one of the judges, Lord Reed, just nails the court's thinking perfectly. He basically said, look, Parliament doesn't just hand out powers for fun. A power is given with an intention, with a purpose. And in this case, the whole point of the act was to make sure the system was fair for farmers. So the final ruling was an absolute bombshell. The House of Lords declared that the minister had acted unlawfully. They ruled that a minister can't use their power to block or, in their words, frustrate the very purpose of the law they're supposed to be upholding. Turns out his unfettered discretion wasn't so unfettered after all. Now, this landmark case didn't just help out a few farmers. It established this incredibly powerful legal principle that would become a cornerstone of public law and government accountability for decades to come. And this principle became known as the Padfield Doctrine. So what is it? Here's the core idea. When a public official is given a power, that power comes with strings attached. It's not a blank check. It has to be used to achieve the goal of the law it came from, not to get out of a politically awkward situation or for some other improper reason. And get this, all of this was decided back in 1968. I mean, what a pivotal year, not just for culture and politics, but for fundamentally changing the relationship between a government and the people it's supposed to serve. So why on earth does a 1960s fight about milk still matter to us today? Well, because it established, once and for all, that government power has limits. It means that officials can't just refuse to do their job because a decision might be politically embarrassing. It confirms that all power has a purpose. And maybe most importantly, it empowers our courts to hold those in power accountable to the law. It's a fundamental check on power that we rely on every single day. And that brings us back to one final critical question. What happens when you give someone power, but you don't give them a detailed rulebook on how to use it? Well, the Padfield case gives us the answer. The purpose behind the power is the rulebook. And that is the fundamental idea that makes sure discretion doesn't turn into dictatorship. Thanks so much for joining me.